to talk about Chapter 27, Lesson 5, the War in the Pacific. So what that means really is, what were the Japanese doing in the Pacific? We already talked about the war in Europe. And so now we're going to talk about what's happening in the Pacific. And remember, these things were happening at the same time that they were happening in Europe. So it's not, a straight timeline. You have to kind of go back in history a little bit. Remember, they're happening at the same time. Okay, so you know that Pearl Harbor was bombed, right, by the Japanese. And they want to try to take out the U.S. military, right? And remember, we've talked before about how the U.S. military has islands in the Pacific that they use as military bases, right? So they're going to also bomb our bases in the Philippines and the islands of Wake Island and Guam. And they invade and they start taking over these places. Japan does. So Thailand, Malaysia, used to be called Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong. So you can kind of imagine, right? They're kind of taking over in the Pacific. And then the Philippines, remember, we've had control of the Philippines, remember? And remember, we had promised the Filipino people their independence. Well, now with Japan coming in and trying to take over, the Filipino people, their soldiers are helping the U.S. try to fight off the Japanese. And to make a long story short, this doesn't go well, and the U.S. keeps getting forced back by the Japanese. And finally, Japan does take control of the Philippines. And this area called Bataan, the soldiers were starving, and they tried to fight and hold out, but they couldn't. And so they finally did, give in. And when they surrendered, then the Japanese took them, both the U.S. soldiers and the Filipino or any allied soldiers, hostage. And they wanted to move them to basically like a concentration camp. And so they made them march. And the march was about 60 miles to get to this prison camp. And remember, they were already starving and in bad health and diseases and things before that. And then they went on this forced march. And of course, they're treated very badly too. One thing you have to know about the Japanese is they believe that soldiers should fight to the death. It was, Japanese did not think it was respectful to give in and to surrender. You've lost your dignity and your honor. And so they really did not respect these allied soldiers who went and surrendered. So they treated them extra badly, beating them along the way. There's a lot of stories of survivors saying that, they would, beat them, they would, kill them, stick them with their rifles. How in the end they can have a knife attached. So terrible treatment too. And they're, marched without enough food and of course, medical care and things. So many of them don't make it. So they say they were about 76,000 when they started, and only 54,000 are going to survive this march to the concentration camp. And then, of course, the concentration camp is also not good, with disease and death rampant there. And then actually many of them end up being sent off to either other camps, or many of them were put on these, what they called them, hell ships, of course, the nickname by the soldiers, overcrowded, unsanitary ships, and they were sent to Japan to work, and forced labor in copper mines and coal mines, and for other Japanese companies, like you might have heard of Mitsubishi, and there's other famous Japanese companies that use this labor. And they were, of course, treated badly there too, and overworked and beaten. There's terrible stories about, being beaten with chains and really treated really badly while they're in this captivity. So sadly, the ones who did survive had really bad post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that now, what that's called. They didn't really have that name, but they really, I read an account once of someone saying that, he was back in the United States. When he saw a Japanese person, he would like be triggered and he would just go and attack the person. Right? And even though it's a Japanese American person, he's back in the United States, his post-traumatic stress is so bad that, he wanted to kill all Japanese, right? So anyway, terrible treatment of those prisoners. Okay. So things weren't looking so good at first, but as they went, the U.S. started doing better and having more victories. I mentioned just a couple they mentioned in the book, the Battle of Coral Sea, in which they defeat a lot of the Japanese fleet. And then the Battle of Midway is pretty famous. They were able to destroy a lot of the aircraft carriers, 4 huge aircraft carriers, and then, of course, hundreds of planes. So that really hurt the Japanese quite a bit in that battle. And so they had this strategy called island hopping, the U.S. did, that they're going to basically go one island at a time, getting closer and closer, capturing those key islands, like hopping, kind of getting closer and closer to Japan, and, using that base to then attack the next base, right? And so there's a map there to kind of show you their strategy. And so I just listed a few of them, and you can see the years going by, right? You don't have to memorize the years, but just so you can kind of know the years. Guadalcanal is a pretty famous one. Getting control of that was big. And then Guam. And then the Battle of Leyte Gulf is in the Philippines, and that was huge because we destroyed most of the Japanese fleet in that battle, so that was really big. So clearly we're doing better and better. In 1945, we were able to get the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and we're getting very close to Japan, right? And that picture with the men raising the flag is on Iwo Jima when we successfully took that island, and it's a very famous photograph showing the different people from different branches of the army actually all planting our flag in like victory. And I actually have in my classroom a cartoon version of it in the classroom, so I'll have to point that out when we're back. And one of the other things that the Japanese did, which is really interesting, is they had kamikazes, you might have heard, or suicide pilots. And remember, they think that, giving up is not an option. So even though they're doing poorly, they have these pilots that believe it's their duty to do whatever's necessary to help. And so they're willing, even death. So I have a video to show you, but they basically load up the planes with some extra bomb materials, and they are supposed to go fly their plane into like an aircraft carrier or a battleship or some target, and they fly it right in, and basically the extra impact with the bombing materials too will like ruin the ship or whatever they're targeting. And so it was pretty effective, right? But you have to be willing to kill yourself because you're flying your plane right in. And they were suicide pilots doing it for the glory and of the emperor, and thought it was like their duty. And so I have a video to show you about that. And so that did a lot of damage for us. So the Japanese are not giving up, even though we are winning. And most countries probably would have thought about giving up, around now. But of course, the Japanese are not going to do that because they don't think, right, you get any honor in giving up. So we do end up using the atomic bomb on them. So let's talk about the atomic bomb. So first of all, it was Albert Einstein who actually gave a heads up to President Roosevelt. He sent him a letter and said, hey, I just thought you should know that the Nazis have been researching like how to use atomic materials and making, devastating bombs. So, you might want to prepare for that. So, all right, because I don't know if you know, Albert Einstein was a German immigrant. So Roosevelt, remember, we're going back in history, right? We had already talked about Truman taking over, but it was back in 1939 when Roosevelt was the president. And Roosevelt looks into it. They go and have some of our scientists go to Britain and meet with their scientists, and they are doing research, and they're saying, yes, this is something. So he starts his own secret project called the Manhattan Project. And it started officially in like 42. And they start us trying to know how to use atomic materials. So the University of Chicago was the first to make successfully a nuclear reactor, which is basically splitting atoms, which then release a very high amount of energy. And then we had, trying to put that into a bomb was the next thing. And so they U.S. did successfully do that. Los Alamos, there was a secret testing facility in New Mexico, and we would test it out in the desert, right, so that it wouldn't hurt anything. And that was in 45. So we know we have the bomb, and the Japanese will not give up. So we give them one more chance. Truman now is the president, and Truman says, if you don't surrender, we're going to, what he called, you'll face prompt and utter destruction. And the Japanese, of course, don't listen. And so Truman says, okay, well, I know it's terrible, but, a lot of Americans are dying in this, and we have to put an end to this war. And if this is what, if they won't listen to reason, then we don't have a choice. So he bombs Hiroshima first, or Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki 3 days later. So these are two major places in Japan. In August of 1945, and the book mentions the bombing, the plane that was called the Enola Gay. It doesn't mention, I don't know why, the kids always know that the names of the bombs more than the bomber. So I put a picture there. You can see a Little Boy and Fat Man are the two names of the bombs. And anyway, so Hiroshima was first, and then Nagasaki a few days later, and it was devastating. I have a video to show you of that too. It just wipes out the entire city and kills a huge amount of people. They have estimates right there because it's hard to know. But they say somewhere between 80,000 to 120,000 people were killed by that first bomb, and then another 35 to 74,000 in the second one. And that's not to mention anyone who survived, who had devastating burns or, of course, sick, right? You know that you're going to get... So anyway, I won't ruin it all, but there's some, and talk about that in the video. Anyway, so finally, they have no choice but to surrender. And they do so, and so VJ Day, victory against Japan, right, was in August of 45, okay, the 15th. All right, and so the costs of the war. Well, of course, it was terrible, right? It's the most destructive conflict in history we've had so far yet to date, we estimate more than 55 million people are killed. That number, of course, is a variety. It's not just soldiers, since we talked about how many civilians were killed, because there's all the bombings in the cities we talked about, and then mass starvation. Remember, we talked about in the Soviet Union, right? And disease, and of course torture and murder. So of course the Holocaust is going to be a good amount of these numbers. And so that brings me to war crimes. So they had a series of trials on both the Nazis leaders and the Japanese leaders about their crimes against humanity. And so, it was not just the Holocaust. We're also talking about the treatment in the, camps. The Japanese, like we said, were terrible, treating war criminals. The soldiers that were captured, right? So anyway, so there were a lot of the head leaders and prison guards and things like that. And if you're found guilty, which a lot of them were, then they were executed, okay? So just to give you numbers, they give you comparisons here. Americans were about 300,000, right? 22. Um, and I have a typo there. And then about 800,000 are wounded. But think about that. We came in later, and the fighting wasn't on our land, right? So for comparison's sake, look at the Soviet Union, which we estimate that they had at least 18 million dead, and they think that actually it was higher than that, and they just don't have good record keeping on that. So extremely devastating World War II, and so, right, we hope that we won't have one again.